can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you!
2019 was the year a 16-year-old girl from Sweden came from obscurity and rallied millions of people around the world calling for action on the climate crisis. Also on the program, the world looked on in horror this year as the Amazon was engulfed in flames. What role did business play in the massive fires? And we meet one Turkish fashion designer who believes green is the new black. Hello, I'm Oscar Sabakti and you're watching Money Talks. From Swedish climate campaigner Greta Thunberg to the international protest movement Extinction Rebellion, 2019 was the year climate activism hit the headlines. Some said we should stop eating red meat, while others suggested giving up air travel. At the same time, we learned global emissions hit an all-time high. So, Sarah Morris asks, for all the noise the protesters are making, is anyone really listening?
Time magazine described her as the most compelling voice on the most important issue facing the planet.
People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you!
A reluctant celebrity, she was rarely out of the headlines in 2019, from addressing heads of state at the UN to being named Time's Person of the Year.
Her sharpest weapon is shame. When she looks at adults and she says, "How dare you? How dare you leave us this planet in this condition?" That's a paraphrase. She's really going for the gut there, and few other activists have been able to harness the emotional power of that argument.
But even Greta says she worries that politicians are only pretending to listen to her. The effectiveness of campaigning is something that weighs on the Extinction Rebellion protest movement too. Risking arrest, the group uses civil disobedience as a tactic. Blocking traffic and public transport, it says causing disruption is the only way to be heard. But tangible progress is slim. Despite years of climate change talks and pledges, global carbon emissions reached an all-time high in 2018, according to a report by the Global Carbon Project. And a spate of natural disasters around the world in 2019 proved governments need to rethink their land and water management. It's clear changing climatic conditions are making it harder to prepare for storms, floods, fires and droughts. But climate activists believe their voices are being heard.
There's a lot of results that are starting to come up, both the British and EU governments sort of declaring a state of climate emergency, and that's creating a ripple effect around the planet. We've had a recent survey of City of London investors, and they've been saying that because of what's been happening with Extinction Rebellion and of course the youth strikes, that investment patterns are starting to change. They're starting to realise that they can no longer invest in fossil fuels.
Giving up red meat has been hailed as a way for individuals to help curb climate change. A UN report this year said switching to plant-based diets could free up land and reduce the emissions from livestock being farmed. And messages like this have helped fuel a boom in the vegan restaurant and food industry. According to the Vegan Society, about 1.2% of the UK population is vegan. That's about 600,000 people. But there are also an increasing number of people who are just trying to eat less meat as well. And as a result, they're coming to restaurants like this one. Jake's Vegan Steaks specialises in cooking with a meat substitute called seitan. The signature dish is the Philadelphia-style cheesesteaks, usually a treat only available to meat eaters.
Delicious. The flavours are really good. It's really fresh. It's slightly different to what we've had before.
There's just a massive impact of eating meat, buying it, consuming it. So I think as a consumer, you feel a lot better when you know that the food you're eating is actually sustainable and it tastes nice as well.
Jake says while he used to target the vegan market, he's now attracting a new type of customer.
So people coming in going, do you know what? I love meat. I eat meat, but this is my vegan day, or this is my way of reducing my meat intake, is having something that looks familiar, tastes familiar, but is completely plant-based.
But the agriculture industry says the message that giving up red meat will save the planet is too simplistic. Livestock accounts for just 5% of British greenhouse gases, and the carbon footprint of UK beef production is 2.5 times lower than the global average.
Climate change and greenhouse gases don't obey political boundaries. So actually one of the things I think the whole world needs to face up to is basing its production in the best places possible. So I actually see opportunities for British agriculture because we're efficient, because we're able to grow grass so well in our maritime climate. I actually see us going forward producing a greater proportion of the world's meat in this country in a sustainable system as opposed to elsewhere where it's less sustainable.
But like Greta Thunberg, the UK Farmers Union agrees climate change is the single biggest issue facing society. It believes it should be the top priority for governments globally. And while these protest groups may have made a lot of noise in 2019, their message is they'll make more in 2020. Sarah Morris, TRT World, London.
Well, for more on this, Sven Harmeling joins us now from Bonn, Germany. He's the Global Policy Lead on Climate Change for CARE. Welcome back to the programme, Sven. Now, it's been quite a year for environmental issues, hasn't it? The standout has to be by far the rise of Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old Swedish girl who managed to really rally millions of people around the world. What impact has she had on the issue of the climate crisis?
Well, I really think what we've seen this year has been an unprecedented level of mass mobilization in many countries. And of course, the youth and in particular Greta Thunberg has played a central role in that. I've seen it in Germany, I've seen it in Europe and many other countries. And I think what this movement helped to do is basically make clear on one hand, climate change is much more than an environmental issue, but it basically gets into all situations of societies. It's a business issue, it's an economic issue, it's a development issue. Many poor countries are affected. And it really showed that we now really running out of time and we need to get basically turn the ship around. And this year, 2020 now really has to become the year of climate action, where 2020 maybe was the year of climate mobilization.
Why do you think it took a 16-year-old like Greta, did she manage to achieve what many scientists, activists have been trying to do for decades, really?
Well, I think it's fair to say it's been a bit of a continuum in the way that also over the last 10 years, there were different moments in time where we had a lot of political mobilization, like the Paris Climate Summit in 2015, and even public mobilization, but not at the same scale. And I think what really Greta managed to do is to carry this narrative and this message. Politicians, you have agreed on the Paris Agreement, and now it's time to deliver, and you're not delivering. And my future and the future of many young people is at risk. And I think she was able to convey this narrative and the urgency and demands in a way that maybe, let's say, us adults haven't been able to do in the last year with the same compelling narrative. And many young people, let's say, came on board and realized, yeah, this is the fight of our lives, and we need to demand adults to take action.
We know Greta Thunberg has attracted praise from various world leaders, environmentalists, as well as activists and celebrities for that matter. But do you think governments and businesses, which are really key in helping to solve the climate crisis, do you think they'll take her words seriously?
Well, I think what I noticed in the last year is there's been a lot of, let's say, general praise and recognition of her arguments, but there's been too little substantive discussion on what needs to be done to really deliver on what climate science is asking from the world to do in terms of getting down emissions, halving emissions by the next decade, basically. And I think there's many positive developments also in the business sector and elsewhere in the cities, but at the moment, it really doesn't add up yet. So what we really need to see is governments really taking this serious and really, identifying the measures that can be taken immediately, those measures which need a bit more time, but where we really shift away from the system that we see now with rising emissions. Still, governments are putting billions of US dollars into subsidizing fossil fuels with a lot of negative side effects, for example, still spending too little on making communities resilient. I think this really has to change now. So in the summary, I think there's a lot of praise and recognition of her arguments, but on substance, we're not yet seeing the actions that are required.
Okay, Sven Harmeling, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you about these issues this year. Look forward to our chats in 2020 here on Money Talks. Thank you. Well, still ahead here on Money Talks, purging plastic. Many countries and businesses promise to tackle plastic pollution as the synthetic material does more damage to the environment. But first, a quick roundup of the other top business stories from around the world in 60 seconds. Ousted Nissan chairman Carlos Ghosn has unexpectedly left Japan and travelled to his home country of Lebanon. In a written statement, Ghosn says he fled what he called injustice and political persecution. The 65-year-old was barred from travelling abroad and was awaiting trial in Tokyo over charges of financial misconduct, which he denies. Chinese telecommunications giant Huawei says its revenue rose 18% to a record $122 billion this year. But the pace of growth was lower than initially expected as a US trade blacklisting hit sales and disrupted its ability to source key parts. Washington has accused the company of being a national security risk. And Turkish Airlines and Boeing have agreed on compensation for losses caused by grounded and undelivered 737 MAX aircraft. In a statement to the Istanbul Stock Exchange, Turkey's flag carrier didn't specify the deal's value, which is reportedly worth $225 million. The airline has been unable to use 24 aircraft in its fleet since the grounding in March. Scenes of plastic waste floating in the ocean and killing marine life have become all too familiar. That's sparked a backlash against the excessive use of plastics. The movement has gained momentum this year, with more governments and companies stepping up. In recent decades, an estimated 450,000 square kilometres of Brazil's Amazon have been converted to cattle pasture. Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro delivered on campaign promises to open up the Amazon for business by scaling back environmental laws and allowing waves of loggers and ranchers to clear more land for lumber and cattle. But when slash and burn techniques ignited uncontrollable fires across the rainforest in August, Bolsonaro's friendship with the private sector made him some powerful international enemies. Reagan Devines reports.
This is what remains of a once vibrant ecosystem. The Amazon rainforest redistributes a significant amount of oxygen back into the atmosphere. But this year, a cancer spread on the planet's lungs. Nearly 10,000 kilometers of the Amazon was burned.
Our first reaction was to cross the information with data on deforested areas. And voila, there is a very strong relation between deforestation and the focus points of heat this year.
Deforestation in Brazil has surged to its highest level in more than a decade. Government data show the pace the forest has been cut down in 2019 rose by 15% over the previous year. Loggers cleared an area the size of a football pitch every minute. Experts say some of the degradation is irreversible.
A catastrophe. When there was no fire, all this was living nature, the animals, the flora and fauna. Now seeing everything being destroyed makes me really sad.
Fires were also started to clear land for farming and cattle ranching. Some of it has been unregulated and increased the rate of accidental spreads.
Big wildfires are a disaster for the climate. They are releasing thousands and millions of tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, but also on the short term, they are putting big amounts of black carbon, smoke into the atmosphere. A big health hazard for people living in the vicinity, but also a strong driver of climate change.
Environmentalists say the increase in fires coincides with the election of Jair Bolsonaro as president in 2018. He promised to use the Amazon to fuel Brazil's economy, but he's compromised environmental laws in the process.
In 2008, we created the Amazon Fund, 80,000 sustainable jobs and money for programs to combat fires. Bolsonaro dismantled all that in a short period of time. His government is the exterminator of a sustainable future. He's a pyromaniac.
In response to international uproar, the president deployed the army to contain the blazes, and G7 countries offered to assist. But Bolsonaro rejected aid after French President Emmanuel Macron accused him of not doing enough to honor climate commitments.
Certain countries, instead of helping, have behaved in a disrespectful manner and with a colonialist spirit. They have even questioned what we hold as a most sacred value, our sovereignty.
4 months, Brazilian authorities battled thousands of fires before they were finally put out. The devastation was stark. The environment minister said a new strategy was needed to stop illegal logging and mining. But President Bolsonaro has doubled down on his nationalistic view of the Amazon. He's described the rainforest as a resource to be exploited. That means the coming year may see more deforestation, mining, agribusiness, and more fires. Regan Devine, TRT World.
And for more, our senior business producer, Mobin Nasser, joins me now in the studio. Hi, Mobin. Now, as we heard there, Jair Bolsonaro's government has been accused of enabling or even encouraging the deforestation of the Amazon. Why is that?
Deforestation has been on the rise since 2012, but we know it's worsened under Bolsonaro. And there seems to be a concerted institutional effort. Now, why do I say that? You've seen lots of complaints about people convicted of deforestation in protected areas being given pardons. There are complaints by indigenous tribes about people attacking their areas and not being arrested or brought to task by law enforcement agencies. The government as a whole, as you know, has been denying climate change altogether. And then as was mentioned in the report, the president continues to mention how this is a resource that has to be exploited and only Brazil will decide what it does with it. But it goes beyond that. They've also dismantled IBAMA, the Environmental Protection Agency of the country. That reduces oversight. They're also taking away permits from protected areas and they're giving approvals to the use of dangerous agrochemicals to be used by especially the farmers who are using these clearings. So really a whole lot of steps that are pushing back years of efforts in this area.
Yes, we hear about the role that businesses are playing in the destruction of the Amazon, businesses like farmers, as you say, as well as ranchers. Why is it so lucrative for them to delve deeper into the Amazon?
I think what we can see is some sort of a reverse relationship, an inverse relationship between how well people are doing in the urban areas and the rate of deforestation. So on the one hand, you have a lack of jobs and poverty in urban areas. That's pushing people deeper into the forest. On the other hand, we've seen Brazil become the biggest exporter of beef in the world. That in turn has driven demand for soybean, which is used as cattle feed. And so now you have a cycle where cattle ranchers are going into areas, using them as pasture land, thereafter selling that land to farmers and then moving deeper into the forest. So this is sort of, in a way, a cycle that's developed, and it's really making the situation worse every year.
We know part of the reason why Jair Bolsonaro was elected was to boost economic growth in Brazil. The economy has been stagnating or at least flagging it, as we've been covering over the past year. How do you believe can Jair Bolsonaro balance the economic imperatives with the imperatives of conserving the Amazon?
Look, it seems like a lot of what the government needs to do is not new. It's stuff that's been done by previous administrations. If you look at Lula da Silva's government, his environment minister, Marina Silva, is largely credited with bringing down the rate of deforestation. So what did they do? Well, on the one hand, they increased, they gave legal cover to people who were already living in these areas, then subjected them to taxes and environmental laws. They also increased the area under protection from about 25% of the forest that is inside Brazil to almost about 50% of the forest under various heads, either belonging to indigenous tribes or to industries that are working in sustainable industries, which brings me to the next point, that the government has to take not just rules to preserve the forest, but also to provide people with other sustainable forms of employment and revenue generation that are not present. So things like rubber tapping or even other industries that can be set up in the urban areas. We saw poverty alleviation programs being introduced by Lula da Silva's government. Again, not all of those things worked. Some of those things, like giving deeds to people who've been in these areas and they could prove that they'd been working in these areas for a few years, encouraged others to move in, hoping that a similar amnesty would be forthcoming a few years down the line. But really, all of that would happen, what must happen before any of those measures can take place, is the government needs to change its stance on deforestation and really wake up and recognize how important it is, not just for Brazil, but for the world.
Okay, Mobin, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you for breaking down that issue for us and for taking us through all the other stories this year. Looking forward to what we have to cover in the new year. Thank you. Well, as we heard, the Amazon rainforest is crucial for the health of our planet. But some industries, like fast fashion, are suffocating it as production processes contribute to global heating. That's why eco-friendly manufacturing has become a burning issue for both consumers and brands. One Turkish designer, Mehtap Alaydi, says going green means more than just using sustainable fabrics. Sibel Karkush caught up with her at Istanbul Fashion Week.
Feminine cuts and breathable fabrics in earthy tones. These pieces are part of Mehtap Alaydi's first fully sustainable collection. The Turkish designer has used eco-friendly materials before and says it's time the textile sector reduces its environmental impact.
I mean, this environment is ours only to protect for the next generations. So I think it's quite important that every designer, every brand should use some sustainable fabrics in sustainable production manners.
And for her, that includes recycling old designs.
We prepare like maybe 80 styles a season, and in 6 months they're gone, they're garbage. So what we did here is some of the styles are from our previous collections, and we updated them to become a whole collection.
According to the UN, the global fashion and textile sector is the second largest polluter in the world after the oil industry. It creates 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's why Alaydi chose fabrics made of what's called EcoVero viscose fibers that are entirely biodegradable.
Our fibers are made from sustainably managed forest. It's made with 50% less use of water, 50% less use of energy. And if you look at the whole fashion industry, by default, it's not a very clean industry. It's a very dirty industry. And I think we have the responsibility to reduce the impact that we make on the planet.
Turkey is one of the 5 biggest ready-to-wear exporters in the world, with an $18 billion market in 2018. But consumers here are becoming increasingly conscious about their environmental impact. And the industry is aware of the trend and putting it up on the runway. For many, sustainability is not just a choice, but a necessity. And that's why this year's Fashion Week in Istanbul offered more space for discussions.
Mercedes-Benz Fashion Week artık sadece bir defileler.
Mercedes-Benz Fashion Week has expanded from just being a runway series. This year we had more fashion talks led by big names of the Turkish fashion scene. One important topic there is sustainability. New fashion concepts have entered the stage, including recycling and reusing.
And Elaidy says sewing that trend into her pieces wasn't hard.
The thought of it is more tiring than the reality of it. Once you get in, you realize that you can do it. It just depends on how much you want it.
Many of her pieces are already sold out. Some of that money will go to a natural heritage fund, showing that sustainability in fashion can go beyond just sales. Sibel Karkush, TRT World, Istanbul.
Well, that's all for Money Talks for now. Thanks for watching and Happy New Year.